His Honda Civic was parked outside, now sporting a small basketball hoop decal on the back window, a gift from Tommy. As he walked to his car, he passed two police officers chatting with some kids from the neighborhood. The officers waved, and David waved back. It wasn't forced or uncomfortable, it was just neighbors acknowledging neighbors. That night at dinner, his mother asked him how it felt to see everything come together. David thought for a moment before answering. "You know what's weird?" he said. That night, Officer Wilson thought he was stopping a crime. But instead, he started something bigger than any of us. A real change in how our community works together. Sometimes good things come from bad moments if we're brave enough to make them happen. His father nodded, and humble enough to learn from them. Through the window, David could see kids playing basketball in the fading light. Some wore black armbands, some didn't. A police car drove by slowly, and the officer inside waved to the kids. They waved back without hesitation. Maybe that was the biggest change of all, not the programs or the policies, but the simple human moments that showed how a community could heal, grow, and become stronger together. 6 months had passed since that eventful evening. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the community center as David adjusted his tie. The same one he'd worn to the press conference, now feeling like a lucky charm. The room was filled with people from all walks of life: police officers, community members, students, and city officials. "Ready?" his mother asked, straightening his tie even though it was already perfect. Today was the first meeting of the new Community Police Partnership Program, and David was giving the opening speech. Looking around the room, he saw familiar faces. Mrs. Robinson sat in the front row, her cookie basket noticeably full. His basketball team occupied an entire row, still wearing their black armbands. It had become their trademark now, a symbol that had spread to other teams across the state. Coach gave him a thumbs up from his seat. The mayor stepped up to the podium first. 6 months ago, an incident in our community opened our eyes to changes that needed to be made. Today, I'm proud to say we haven't just talked about change, we've made it happen. She began listing the changes: mandatory de-escalation training for all officers, a new community oversight board, regular town halls between police and residents, and a scholarship program for minority students interested in law enforcement careers. But most importantly, she announced, every new officer would spend their first month doing community service, getting to know the people they would serve and protect. When it was David's turn to speak, he took a deep breath and looked out at the crowd. Tommy, the boy from the library, sat with his parents wearing a miniature version of David's basketball jersey. Several new police academy graduates were present, their faces eager and attentive. 6 months ago, David began, I was just a kid with a used Honda Civic and a dream of playing college basketball. Today, I'm still that same kid, but I've learned something important about community, about justice, and about how change really happens. He shared the story again, but this time focusing on what came after, the community's response, the department's willingness to change, the way people came together instead of falling apart. He talked about Tommy and the other kids who needed to see that standing up for yourself didn't mean losing your dignity. Real change, he continued, isn't just about policies and procedures, it's about people. It's about officers getting to know the communities they serve. It's about young people seeing police as protectors, not threats. It's about building trust, one conversation at a time. The new community center program would pair officers with local youth for mentoring, sports programs, and tutoring. David would be helping to run the basketball program, working alongside officers who wanted to make a difference. After the speech, as people mingled and enjoyed Mrs. Robinson's cookies, David's father pulled him aside. "Remember when you said you didn't ask for any of this?" he asked. "Look around. Sometimes the things we don't ask for end up being the things that matter most." David watched as Tommy showed one of the new officers his basketball moves. The officer, a young woman who'd graduated from the academy just last week, was giving him tips on his dribbling. Nearby, his mother was talking with other parents about expanding the program to more neighborhoods. His phone buzzed, a message from the college basketball recruiter who'd been watching him all season. But this time, it wasn't about his jump shot. The college wanted him to speak at their law enforcement training program about community relations. As the day went on, David found himself sitting with a group of new police cadets during lunch. They were talking about their hopes for serving the community, their fears of making mistakes, their desire to do the job right. One of them asked about that night, about how he stayed so calm. "I just remembered what my parents taught me," David replied. "That dignity isn't something someone else can take from you, it's something you hold on to by how you act, especially in the hardest moments." Later, as he helped clean up after the event, David found himself back in the main room alone. The setting sun cast long shadows through the windows, reminding him of that evening 6 months ago. But now, those shadows didn't bring back fear or anger. Instead, they reminded him of how far they'd come and how far they still had to go. Inside, his mother was on the phone, talking to one of the civil rights lawyers who'd reached out. They weren't just looking for a lawsuit. They wanted to work with the department on reform, to use what happened to David as a catalyst for positive change. "The lawyer says your story is different," his mother told him after hanging up. "Not because of what happened to you, sadly that happens too often, but because of how you handled it, how the community responded, and how the department is actually taking steps to change. You've started something, baby." David sat down at the kitchen table, thinking about Tommy from the library, about the youth council invitation, about his teammates wearing those black armbands. He thought about Mrs. Robinson and her cookies, about the reporters who were still calling, about the flowers marking that spot on the street. "I didn't ask for any of this," he said quietly. His mother came and sat beside him. "None of us ask for our moments, honey. They find us. What matters is what we do with them when they come." Outside, the sound of basketballs bouncing echoed down the street. David looked out to see Tommy and some other kids playing in a driveway. They were all wearing black armbands, just like his team had worn. Sometimes change comes in big moments, press conferences and policy changes and fired officers. But sometimes it comes in smaller ones, in children wearing armbands, in cookies handed out at protests, in quiet conversations at library tables. David was starting to understand that both kinds of change mattered. The next few days seemed to fly by in a blur of activity. David tried to keep his normal routine, school, basketball practice, helping Mrs. Robinson with her groceries, but things were different now. People looked at him differently, not with pity but with a kind of respect he hadn't expected. One afternoon, as he sat doing homework in the local library, a young boy approached his table. The kid couldn't have been more than 10 years old, clutching a basketball under his arm. "Are you the guy from the news?" the boy asked quietly. "The one who stayed calm when the police officer was mean to you?" David put down his pencil and smiled. "Yeah, that's me. What's your name, buddy?" "Tommy," the boy replied. "My dad says you're a hero. He says you showed people how to stand up for yourself the right way." Before David could respond, Tommy's father hurried over. "I'm so sorry to bother you," he began, but David shook his head. "It's no bother at all," David said, standing to shake the man's hand. "Your son was just telling me what you said about standing up for yourself the right way." The father smiled, a bit embarrassed. "Well, it's true. My wife and we've been trying to figure out how to talk to Tommy about these things, how to prepare him without making him afraid. And then you showed everyone exactly how it should be done." As they talked, David noticed other people in the library pretending not to listen while stealing glances their way. Some smiled encouragingly. A few nodded in agreement with Tommy's dad. The librarian, who'd known David since he was Tommy's age, beamed proudly from behind her desk. Later that evening, during basketball practice, Coach called the team together for an unusual mid-practice meeting. "I got a call today," he announced, looking straight at David. "The State Basketball Association wants to implement new training for all referees and officials. They want to address bias in how games are called, how players are treated, and they want our captain here to help develop the program." The gym erupted in cheers and backslaps. David stood there stunned. "Me? But I'm just a high school player." "You're more than that now," Coach replied. "You've shown leadership in a way that goes beyond sports. Sometimes the most important plays happen off the court." After practice, as David was putting away the equipment, his phone buzzed with a message from his mother. The police department's internal affairs investigation had been completed. Officer Wilson hadn't just been suspended, he'd been terminated. But that wasn't all. The department was implementing new policies, including mandatory community service hours for all officers and regular meetings with neighborhood residents. Walking to his car, the same Honda Civic that had started it all, David noticed someone had left a note under his windshield wiper. His heart skipped a beat for a moment, remembering that night. But when he opened it, he found a handwritten letter from a local youth group. They wanted him to speak at their next meeting about how to handle difficult situations with dignity. As he drove home, David passed the spot where he'd been handcuffed just days ago. Someone had placed flowers there, like a memorial, but not one of sadness, more like marking the spot where change began. His father was waiting on the porch when he got home, holding a letter. "This came today," he said, handing it to David, from the mayor's office. The letter was an invitation to join a newly formed youth advisory council for the police department. They wanted young people's perspectives on law enforcement policies, training, and community relations. David's name was at the top of their list. "They're not just trying to sweep this under the rug," his father said proudly. "They're trying to learn from it to make real changes, and they want you to be part of that change." "I'd like to address David directly, if I may," he said, turning to look at David. The cameras swiveled, but David held his ground. "Young man, you showed remarkable poise yesterday. The kind of calm and dignity that, frankly, we try to train our officers to display. I want to personally apologize to you and to thank you, because your experience, while deeply unfortunate, is going to help us make real changes." The room erupted in camera flashes. David's teammates started a slow clap that spread through the room. Mrs. Robinson dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, still clutching her now half-empty cookie basket. After the press conference, as they made their way through the crowd of reporters, David's mother turned to him. "I'm so proud of you, baby. But remember, this isn't the end. It's just the beginning of making things right." David nodded, straightening his tie one more time. His phone buzzed, the team reminding him about practice. Somehow, in the middle of all this, there was still basketball, still normal life. And maybe that was the most important victory, that they couldn't take his normal life away from him. As they walked out into the bright afternoon sun, David saw more community members gathered outside with signs. But now they weren't just protest signs. Some read "Future Leader" and "Role Model." One that particularly caught his eye said, "Character shows in how you handle the hard times." His father put an arm around his shoulders as they walked to the car. "Ready for practice, Captain?" David smiled. "Yeah, but can we stop by Mrs. Robinson's first? I think she's given away all her cookies to the reporters. Someone needs to make sure she's got enough for herself." The police station's press room was packed well before noon. News cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking like mechanical fireflies. David sat between his parents in the front row, trying to look calm despite the butterflies in his stomach. His basketball team had shown up in full uniform, filling an entire row behind him. Each player wore a black armband, just as promised. "You okay?" his father whispered, noticing David's hands fidgeting with his tie. David nodded slightly. The tie had been his idea. He wanted to look professional, to show everyone that he was exactly what his mother had always taught him to be, dignified in the face of injustice. The police chief walked in, followed by several other officials. David recognized the mayor among them, looking uncomfortable in the harsh camera lights. The chief approached the podium, shuffling papers and clearing his throat before speaking. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice echoing through the microphones. "We're here today to address an incident that occurred yesterday evening involving one of our officers and a young member of our community." The room was silent except for the click of cameras. David could feel everyone's eyes shifting between him and the chief. After reviewing body camera footage, civilian recordings, and speaking with all parties involved, it has become clear that proper protocols were not followed during this traffic stop. Officer Wilson failed to verify vehicle information before initiating contact, failed to follow standard procedures during the stop, and made assumptions that led to the unnecessary detention of an innocent young man. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. David's mother reached over and squeezed his hand. Effective immediately. The chief continued, "Officer Wilson has been placed on unpaid administrative leave pending a full investigation. Additionally, we will be implementing mandatory retraining for all officers on traffic stop protocols and bias awareness." The mayor stepped forward then, adding her own statement. "What happened yesterday is not representative of our community values. We've heard from countless citizens since last night, all sharing stories about this young man's character, his academic achievements, his leadership on the basketball team, his volunteer work with elderly neighbors. This incident has shown us that we need to do better. David sat up straighter as he listened. His coach had told him once that leadership wasn't about being in charge, it was about taking care of the people in your charge. Now, somehow, he had become the center of something much bigger than himself. A reporter raised her hand. "Chief, you mentioned other complaints against Officer Wilson. Can you elaborate on those?" The chief looked uncomfortable but answered, "Yes. There have been 3 similar complaints in the past year. All involved traffic stops where proper protocols weren't followed. All involved minority drivers. We're reviewing those cases as well." Another reporter, "And what about the supposed stolen vehicle report that Officer Wilson claimed he was investigating?" "There was no such report in our system," the chief admitted. "This fact has been confirmed by our dispatch records." The questions continued, but David's attention was drawn to movement at the back of the room. Mrs. Robinson had somehow made her way in, carrying her cookie basket. She was quietly passing out cookies to reporters, whispering what seemed to be her own commentary on each answer the chief gave. A small smile crossed David's face. His neighborhood was like that. They took care of their own, whether with protest signs or chocolate chip cookies. The chief was still speaking. "We're announcing several immediate changes to department policy. First, all officers must verify plate numbers through dispatch before initiating any stolen vehicle stops. Second, we're implementing a new community oversight board to review complaints. Third, we're expanding our community outreach programs." David's father leaned over. "You doing okay? Want to step out for a minute?" But David shook his head. He needed to be here, needed to see this through. His teammates behind him were taking notes. Actual notes, like they were in a game strategy session. His mother was recording everything on her phone, her banker's precision showing in how she documented each promised change. Then something unexpected happened. The chief went off script. "The community lawyer called too," his mother added. "She says what happened was a clear violation of protocol. Officers are required to verify plate numbers before making stops based on stolen vehicle reports, which didn't even exist in this case." David turned back to his parents. "So what do we do now?" His father smiled sadly. "Now, son, we do what we've always done. We stand up straight, we tell the truth, and we make sure our voice is heard. But this time, we've got the whole community standing with us." As if to emphasize his point, they could hear chanting starting outside. David returned to the window. A group of his classmates had gathered, holding handmade signs. "Stand with David. Check the plates, not the race. Our community demands justice." "Look at that," his mother said, joining them at the window. "You're not alone in this, baby. Far from it." David took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and finally made his decision. "Okay, let's go to that press conference. But first," he managed a small grin. "Can we stop by Mrs. Robinson's house? Looks like she's giving away all her cookies to the news people, and you know her cookies always help me think better." His parents laughed, and for a moment, the tension broke. They were still a family, still strong, still together. And now they had a whole community behind them, ready to turn this moment of injustice into a catalyst for real change. The next morning, David sat at his kitchen table, still trying to process everything that had happened. The local morning news was playing on the small TV in the corner, showing clips from last night's incident. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since he woke up, messages of support, news interview requests, and even calls from civil rights organizations. "You barely touched your breakfast," his mother said softly, sitting down next to him with a cup of coffee. She hadn't slept much. He could tell from the dark circles under her eyes. But there was still that same determination in her face that he'd seen yesterday. "I keep thinking about basketball practice," David said, pushing his eggs around his plate. "Coach moved it to today instead, but..." "But what, honey?" "But everyone's going to be looking at me different now, aren't they? Like I'm some kind of symbol or something." Before his mother could answer, David's father walked in, already dressed for work, but holding a newspaper instead of his usual briefcase. The front page showed a photo from last night. David standing calmly in handcuffs while his mother confronted Officer Wilson. The headline read, "Local honor student handcuffed for driving own car. Community demands answers." The police chief called this morning, his father said, placing the newspaper on the table. They're holding a press conference at noon. They want us to be there. David looked up, surprised. Do we have to go? His mother reached over and took his hand. No, baby, we don't have to do anything. But sometimes the best way to make sure this doesn't happen to another kid is to stand up and speak out. The news in the background switched to a different angle of last night's scene. They were interviewing Mrs. Robinson, the elderly neighbor who'd watched everything unfold. I've known that boy since he was little, she was saying, wiping tears from her eyes. He helps me with my groceries every week. He's a good boy. How many more good children have to go through this? David's phone buzzed again. It was his best friend. Whole team's behind you, Captain. We've got practice at 2. We're all wearing black armbands. Coach's idea. A small smile finally crossed David's face. He showed the message to his parents. The police chief also mentioned something else. His father said carefully, Officer Wilson has a history of complaints. 3 other similar incidents in the past year alone. They've been swept under the rug until now. Until now, David's mother repeated, her voice firm. Because this time, we have it all on video. This time, the whole community saw it happen. David stood up and walked to the window. Their usually quiet street was lined with news vans. He could see reporters setting up their equipment, preparing for live morning broadcasts. Some held cups of coffee from the local diner, talking with neighbors who had gathered to share what they'd witnessed. You know what bothers me the most? David said, still looking out the window. He never even checked the plates. If he had just run the plates first, checked the registration, but he saw me and he just assumed. His father came to stand beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. That's exactly why we need to be at that press conference. That's what needs to change. David's phone buzzed yet again. This time it was his guidance counselor. The college board rep saw the news. She wants you to know this won't affect your scholarship applications. In fact, she's impressed with how you handled yourself. The morning sun was getting stronger now, making the news van's satellite dishes glint and sparkle. David watched as Mrs. Robinson walked down the street, carrying what looked like a plate of her famous cookies. She stopped at every news van, handing out cookies and, no doubt, telling them all about the good boy she'd known for years. The news reporter was capturing it all. In the background, you could hear her saying, "We'll live at the scene where what appears to be a routine traffic stop has exposed concerning questions about police procedures and profiling in our community." David finally spoke up again, his voice clear and steady. "I just want to know one thing, Officer Wilson. What made you so sure this car was stolen? What was the description you were supposedly looking for?" The silence that followed his question was deafening. Officer Wilson had no answer because there had been no stolen car report. No description, no probable cause, just assumptions and biases that had led to a 17-year-old honor student being handcuffed on the side of the road. The senior officer was already on his radio, calling for a supervisor to come to the scene. More news vans were pulling up. David's phone had finally stopped buzzing, probably because everyone who would be calling him was already there, standing in the growing crowd of supporters. As the evening lights fully took over from the setting sun, it was clear that this incident wouldn't be brushed aside or forgotten. The community had witnessed it. The news was covering it. And most importantly, a mother had stood up and demanded accountability, armed with nothing but the truth and a folder full of documents that proved just how wrong this whole situation had been. David's mother approached the scene like a force of nature, her heels clicking against the pavement with purpose. She'd clearly come straight from her job at the bank, still wearing her professional suit and carrying her leather briefcase. The crowd parted for her automatically, sensing her determination. "What is going on here?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the evening air. "Why is my son in handcuffs?" Officer Wilson turned, clearly startled by her sudden appearance. "Ma'am, this is an active investigation. I need you to step back." "I will not step back," she interrupted, opening her briefcase with practiced efficiency. "I have every single document proving my son owns this car. I was there when he bought it. I helped him pay for it. And I want to know why you have him in handcuffs without even running the plates first." The gathering crowd murmured in approval. More phones were recording now, capturing every word of the exchange. David stood quietly, still handcuffed, watching his mother do what she'd always done best, advocate for him with unwavering strength. Here, she continued, pulling out a folder. Bill of sale, dated 2 weeks ago. Insurance documentation. Registration. Bank statements showing the withdrawal for the purchase. Even pictures from the day we bought it. She held up her phone, showing a photo of David grinning proudly next to his new car, the previous owner shaking his hand. Officer Wilson's face began to redden as he reluctantly looked at the documents. The backup officers he called were exchanging uncomfortable glances. One of them stepped forward, a more senior officer based on his insignia. Wilson, the senior officer said quietly, "Dispatch just got back about those plates. The car's clean. Registered 2 weeks ago too." He glanced at the paperwork in his hands, then at David's mother's documents. The matching information was clear. The crowd had grown larger, their murmurs getting louder. Someone from the local news had shown up. Apparently, word had spread fast in their small community. A reporter was already doing a live broadcast from across the street. "I want these handcuffs off my son right now," David's mother demanded. Her voice was controlled but trembling with anger. "And then I want to know exactly what probable cause you had for this stop, Officer Wilson, because from where I'm standing, there was no stolen car report. Was there?" The senior officer quickly moved to remove David's handcuffs. As they came off, David slowly rolled his shoulders, trying to ease the discomfort. Red marks were visible on his wrists where the cuffs had been too tight. "Mom," David said softly, speaking for the first time since she arrived, "I'm okay." But his mother wasn't finished. "My son did everything right. Everything we taught him to do when stopped by police. He was polite. He was compliant. He offered to show you documentation. And still, you put him in handcuffs. On the side of the road, for driving his own car." By now, several members of the community had recognized David. His basketball coach had arrived, still in his gym clothes. A teacher from his school was there too, shaking her head in disbelief. The elderly woman who had watched the whole thing unfold was telling anyone who would listen about what a good boy David was, how he helped her with her groceries every week. Officer Wilson attempted to defend himself. "I was responding to a possible." His voice trailed off as he realized the hole he was digging was just getting deeper. The senior officer stepped in again. "Ma'am, on behalf of the department, I want to apologize for this misunderstanding. We'll be conducting a full review of this incident." "A misunderstanding?" David's mother's voice was ice cold. "Is that what we're calling racial profiling now? A misunderstanding?" Someone in the crowd called out, "She's right." Others joined in, their voices growing louder. But they weren't angry shouts. They were voices of support, of community members who'd had enough of seeing these misunderstandings happen to their children. More patrol cars were arriving now, their lights painting the growing crowd in alternating red and blue. David could see people shaking their heads, some arguing with other officers who were trying to move them back. His shoulders were starting to ache from the tight handcuffs, but he stood still, remembering his father's words. "Sometimes, son, the only power we have is in staying calm." A few yards away, he could hear someone on their phone. "Yeah, they've got this kid in handcuffs." "No, he's just a teenager, says it's his own car." The word was spreading, and with each passing minute, more people gathered. Then David heard a familiar voice cutting through the chaos, a voice that made his heart sink and soar at the same time. His mother. She must have gotten a call from someone who recognized him. He turned to see her marching toward the scene, her work badge still hanging around her neck, her face a mixture of fury and fear. The next few moments would change everything. But as David stood there, watching his mother approach with fire in her eyes and documents in her hand, he knew one thing for certain. The truth was about to come out, and someone would have to answer for this. The officer approached David's car slowly, flashlight beam bouncing off the side mirrors even though it was still daylight. David could feel his phone vibrating in his pocket, probably his friend wondering where he was. But he didn't dare move his hands from the steering wheel. "License and registration," the officer demanded, not even bothering with a greeting. His nameplate read Officer Wilson, and his hand was already resting on his belt. David noticed all this in quick glances, trying not to make direct eye contact for too long. Another thing his parents had taught him. "Yes, sir," David replied calmly, his voice steady despite his racing heart. My license is in my wallet, and the registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for them now, if that's okay." The officer nodded stiffly, and David moved slowly, deliberately, narrating each movement. "I'm reaching for my wallet now. Now I'm opening the glove compartment." Just like his dad had practiced with him dozens of times in their driveway. As David handed over his documents, Officer Wilson barely glanced at them before saying, "Step out of the vehicle." "Sir?" David's confusion was genuine. "May I ask what this is about?" "This vehicle matches the description of a stolen car reported in the area," Wilson replied, his tone sharp. "Step out of the vehicle now." David's mind raced. Stolen car. That couldn't be right. He had all the paperwork, the bill of sale, the registration, everything. "Officer, I have proof that this is my car. I just bought it 2 weeks ago. The paperwork is right here in there." "I said step out of the vehicle." Wilson's voice rose, his hand now firmly on his weapon. David's heart hammered in his chest, but he kept his movements slow and deliberate as he unbuckled his seatbelt. The setting sun cast long shadows across the street, and he could see people slowing down to watch. Some had their phones out, recording. As he stepped out of the car, the cool evening air hit his face. "Sir, please, I can prove this is my car. I have the bill of sale on my phone, and my mom can verify." "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Wilson interrupted, already pulling out his handcuffs. "But sir, I haven't done anything wrong." David protested, even as he complied with the officer's orders. He could feel the cold metal of the handcuffs clicking around his wrists, too tight, biting into his skin. More cars were slowing down now. David spotted several people with their phones out, recording the scene. His own phone was still buzzing in his pocket, probably his friend, his coach, maybe even his mom wondering why he wasn't answering. "I've got a possible stolen vehicle suspect in custody," Wilson spoke into his radio, ignoring David's continued attempts to explain. "Requesting backup at Main Street, near the mall entrance." A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk. David could hear their murmurs, see their concerned faces. An elderly woman he recognized from his neighborhood looked like she was about to cry. A couple of guys from his school had stopped their car across the street, phones out, faces angry. "Officer, please." David tried again, his voice still remarkably composed despite the situation. "Just check the registration. Call my mom. She helped me buy this car. We have all the paperwork. This is a mistake." But Wilson wasn't listening. He was too busy calling in the plates, something he should have done before pulling David over. The sun had nearly set now, and the mall's bright lights were flickering on, creating a surreal backdrop to this nightmare. David stood there, handcuffed, watching as Officer Wilson roughly surged through his car. His basketball rolled out of the backseat when Wilson opened the door, bouncing once before rolling into the gutter. The water bottles he'd so carefully packed for practice clattered to the ground. He put on his turn signal, carefully pulled over to the right side of the road, and turned off the engine. As he waited, hands visible on the steering wheel, just like his parents had taught him, David couldn't help but wonder what he could have done wrong. The registration was current, he hadn't been speeding, all his lights were working, he checked them just this morning. Through his side mirror, he watched as the officer got out of the cruiser. The sun had dipped lower now, casting long shadows across the street. David took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady as he reached for his wallet, which contained his license and the carefully folded insurance card his mom had helped him laminate. Little did he know, this routine traffic stop was about to become anything but routine. The next few minutes would not only change his life, but would spark a conversation that would reach far beyond their small community. But for now, David sat there, heart pounding but mind clear, watching the approaching officer in his mirror and hoping this would just be a quick misunderstanding. The sun was just beginning to set on a warm Friday afternoon as David pulled out of the driveway in his 2012 Honda Civic. The car wasn't much to look at, a few scratches here and there, and the silver paint had started to fade in places, but to him, it was everything. Every single scratch told a story of the previous owner, and now it was his turn to add his own chapters to this car's history. 2 years of working at Joe's corner store after school and on weekends, carefully saving every dollar, had finally paid off. His mom had matched his savings as a graduation gift, tears in her eyes when she handed him the envelope. "You earned this," she'd said, hugging him tight. "I'm so proud of you." The memory made him smile as he adjusted the rearview mirror. The car still had that distinct used car smell mixed with the pine-scented air freshener he'd hung up yesterday. His basketball gear rattled around in the trunk as he drove, the familiar sound of his lucky basketball bouncing against his gym bag with each turn. The neighborhood streets were quiet, with just a few kids riding their bikes and some elderly folks taking their evening walks. David waved at Mrs. Thompson, who was tending to her famous rose garden. She'd been giving him cookies since he was knee-high, and even now, at 17, she'd still slipped him a chocolate chip cookie whenever he helped her with her groceries. He'd planned everything perfectly today. Leave home at 4:30, pick up his best friend from work at 5 o'clock, and then head to basketball practice together. Coach had made him team captain last week, and he wasn't about to be late. His phone buzzed with a text from his friend. "Don't forget to grab the water bottles this time." David chuckled, remembering last practice when they'd all had to share 2 water bottles because he'd forgotten to bring the team's water supply. As team captain, he had new responsibilities now, and he took them seriously. The water bottles were already packed. He double-checked before leaving home. The radio played softly in the background, some old-school hip-hop his dad had introduced him to. The beat matched his mood perfectly as he drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, thinking about the upcoming regional championships. Their team had a real shot this year, and colleges would be watching. With his grades and hopefully a good basketball season, that scholarship he'd been dreaming about didn't seem so far out of reach anymore. Traffic was light as he turned onto Main Street, passing by the spots that marked his childhood. The ice cream shop where he'd lost his first tooth, the library where he'd spent countless summer afternoons, and the park where he'd learned to ride a bike. Each place held a memory, and now he was making new ones with his very own car. He stopped at a red light, taking a moment to check his phone's GPS. His friend had just started a new job at the mall, and David wanted to make sure he took the quickest route. As he waited for the light to turn green, he noticed a police cruiser in his rearview mirror. Nothing unusual about that. There were always patrol cars around this time of day. The light turned green, and David carefully accelerated, making sure to stay exactly at the speed limit. His parents had drilled traffic rules into his head since he got his learner's permit. "It's not just about being a good driver," his dad always said. "It's about being the most responsible driver on the road." He could see the mall up ahead, its large parking lot already starting to fill up with the usual Friday evening crowd. The police cruiser was still behind him, and something about the way it followed made David's stomach tighten slightly. He double-checked his speed, still perfect at 35 miles per hour. His registration and insurance papers were properly filed in the glove compartment. He'd organized them himself just yesterday. The next few moments would change everything, though David didn't know it yet. As he signaled to turn into the mall parking lot, the police cruiser's lights suddenly flashed to life, its siren wailing through the peaceful evening air. David's heart jumped into his throat, but he stayed calm, remembering everything his parents had taught him about interacting with law enforcement.